Welcome to International Partnership Prayer. I'm Philip Helmintoller. Yesterday we left off describing what happened with Lucifer in heaven, who he was. We talked a little bit about who Adam was, who Eve was. Obviously we know who God is. And we see these partners. We see this conversation taking place in the Garden of Eden. So now we have Lucifer, who is the most beautiful creation that God's ever created, who knows what God looks like, knows what God talks like. He has tried to speak just like God. But we talked about this yesterday, that Lucifer is not a faith being. Lucifer is an angel. His job is to bring about those people who are using faith. That's the job of an angel. He's a ministering spirit sent forth to minister to those who are heirs of soteria. That's us. We're faith beings. So now you have Adam, who is a son of God. You have Eve, who is a daughter of God. And these two are joint. There is no Adam over Eve, Eve over Adam. Every bit of glory that Adam had on him, Eve had on her. Every bit of authority that Adam had on his life, Eve had on her life. Now we have God, who gave dominion of the planet over to Adam. Adam then now shares it with his bride. We have them in the Garden of Eden, and now we have Lucifer, who knows what God looks like, talks like, acts like, and we have him loose in the garden. Quite the drama unfolding in the Garden of Eden. But we have Lucifer, who says, hey, Eve, hey, did God really say you couldn't touch of the fruit of the tree of the knowledge of good and evil? The reason he said that is because he knows that if you touch that tree, you're going to be just like him. You're going to know the difference between good and evil. Well, God obviously knows the difference between good and evil. And Satan wasn't lying to Eve. And there Adam stood and watched this drama unfold and didn't do a single thing to stop it. He is just as guilty in that fall as Eve was. And so Eve goes, well, I want to please the Father. I want to be just like my dad. So what does she do? She reaches out and she touches the fruit. Now she knows the moment that she touched that fruit, she was separated from God. But remember we talked about this yesterday? Genesis chapter 2. I want you to look at the verse, in verse 24, second to last verse. Therefore shall a man leave his father and mother, and they shall cleave unto his wife, and they shall be one flesh. This was prior to chapter 3. This is before the fall. This is before Eve touched the fruit. God issued a commandment to Adam. Leave your father and mother and cleave to your wife, and you two shall be one flesh. Now, if we go over to 1 Timothy, you're going to find this fascinating. I know I did. Listen to this. Look in verse 13 of Timothy chapter number 2. It said, and Adam was first formed, then Eve. Adam was not deceived, but the woman, being deceived, was in the transgression. Now, I read that to say this. Adam stood there like a chump and did not intervene when he should have stood up and rebuked or cursed or killed Lucifer when he had the chance. He didn't. He let his wife touch the fruit. He was not deceived by the serpent, but he didn't step up to the plate either and stop it. Now, the word deceived means that Eve was doing something from a state of innocence. Now, this is important that you understand this. Eve was, how do we say this? Eve thought what she was doing was going to honor her father. The word deceived means she did not know what she was about to do was going to be entering into sin. She was completely, in other words, her act of touching it was a state of innocence. She did not believe that by her touching it, she was going to fall into sin. But that's neither here nor there. As soon as she touched it, she entered into sin. And remember the commandment. Husbands, leave your father and mother, cleave to your wife, and these two shall be one flesh. Adam is in a predicament. He was told not to touch the tree of the knowledge of good and evil. He was also told to leave his father and mother and cleave to his wife, and these two shall be one flesh. Let me ask you a question. Do you think by, I don't know, some accident, possibly God knew ahead of time that Eve was going to touch the fruit? And he knew that Adam, his son, would move in the same love, and that maybe he had a backup plan that he was going to rescue all of us from? God knew what was going to happen in the garden that day. It was no great surprise to him when he came by the next morning and said, Adam, Adam, and they're over there hiding themselves in a bunch of fig leaves. God knew what was going to happen. Well, something dramatic took place at this point. When Adam touched the fruit, he went from a spirit being, he went from a glorified body to a flesh being. Now I want to describe what took place. What Adam had in him right then was a righteous seed, or in right standing with God. He had a seed that did not want to sin, did not want to enter into sin, did not want to have anything to do with sin. That's the seed he had in him. The moment that he touched the fruit, the seed of sin was placed in him. And every one of us when we're born. You see, sin is not the acts that you commit. Now, those are called sin. You can say, well, I slept with so-and-so, or I did drugs, or I've cussed, or I'm angry, or I've, lied, or whatever sin you want to call it. Those are the effects of the sin seed that's in us. It's kind of like a power plant, okay? You have inside your home, like right now in the studio, we have these lights all over the place. And these lights are activated by a light switch. You can flip on the light switch and power comes to these lights. But the house that you're in, or the studio that we're in, or the restaurants that you go in, or Walmart or the mall or any other place that you go visit, the power that's there is not being generated by those locations. They're being generated by a power source located at a power plant. The power plant is what gives you all the types of electricity that there are. There are fluorescent bulbs, and there are energy-saving bulbs, there's black light bulbs, there's all different types of bulbs, but all of them are regulated, and all of them are given power by a power plant. The sin that is present in people's lives is not what is causing them to sin. It's not because they have an addiction. It's because there is a sin seed on the inside of them that is feeding one area greater than another area. And so what happens is people start to sin. They sin, and they call that sin, when in actuality, let's put the light on what it actually is. It is the seed that is placed on the inside of them that is causing them to sin. That's important you understand that, because that is what God came to fix. We get caught up in this, well, Jesus is coming to take away our sins, and oh, he's going to take away all of our sins, but man, we're still suffering with this and suffering with that. When this series is over, mark my word, you're going to know that you are free from sin. Now let's take a look at the Levitical system. The Levitical system was a system that was developed by God in which to forgive the sins of the nation of Israel every single year. Turn over to Hebrews chapter 10. Let's go through and see. I love Hebrews. It's in the New Testament. And Hebrews chapter 10 is probably the best chapter in the Word that deals with the Old Testament and the New Testament covenants coming together and merging as one. So Hebrews chapter 10, verse number 1, for the law, having the shadow of good things to come, and not the very image of things, could never with those sacrifices offered year by year continually make the comers thereunto perfect. For then they would have not ceased to be offered, because the worshippers, once purged, should have had no more consciousness of sin. But in those sacrifices there is remembrance again made of sins year by year, for it is not possible that the blood of bull and goats should take away sins. What he's saying is, under the Levitical system, every single year, what would happen is all the nation of Israel would come together, and they would take a lamb, a spotless lamb, and they would sacrifice that lamb and take the blood of that lamb, put it into a basin. Then the high priest would take the sins of the nation of Israel and he would place it on the head of that scapegoat. There was a goat that was brought out. He'd place the sins on the head of the scapegoat, and then they would take the blood of that lamb and they would pour it upon the head of the scapegoat, and then the high priest would take that into the wilderness. He would take that goat into the wilderness, and God would say, okay, the sins of the nation of Israel for this year are paid for. But what God says here in Hebrews is that those sins, if, and read this, verse number 2, for then they would have not ceased to be offered, because the worshipers, once purged, should have had no more consciousness of sin. What he's saying is that the sacrifices in the Levitical system could not remove sin consciousness. But every single year, the comers thereunto were always reminded of the sin year by year, verses number 5 and 6. They were always reminded of what they did wrong, because it didn't remove their sin nature, and it certainly didn't remove their sin consciousness. It simply paid their sin debt between them and the Father. That was the Levitical system. But what it implied is that there was a sacrifice coming that would make the comers thereunto perfect. And it's saying here, it's saying that once they, but in those sacrifices, verse 3, there is remembrance of sins every year, for it is not possible with the blood of bulls and goats, that it should take away sins. Wherefore, when he cometh unto the world, he saith, the sacrifice and offering that wouldst not, but a body hast prepared for me, in burnt offerings and sacrifices for sin, thou hast no pleasure. So in those sacrifices, God would use them to forgive the sin, but he would not remove the sin, the seed of sin, from in them. That took a perfect lamb. Now, under the Levitical system, God required that the spotless, most perfect lamb that the nation of Israel had would be the lamb that was sacrificed for sin. Now, that's what he required. He required the very best. So when it came time for him to sacrifice, God could not give anything else. I've often wondered as a kid growing up, well, why didn't he just kill off Gabriel? I mean, why not sacrifice Michael? Why couldn't he come up with some angel? And the reason being is he could not give us a standard and a law by which to live that he himself would not then have to be required to be adhere to. And that sacrifice was his son. So now, if we look in verse number 9, then said he, Lo, I come to do thy will, O God. He taketh away the first, that he may establish the second. He's taking away the first policy that was in place for the forgiveness of sin, which was the lamb sacrifice, so that he could establish the second, by the which we are sanctified through the offering of the body of Jesus Christ once for all. Now the word sanctified here, it says, by the which we are sanctified. The word sanctified means to be set apart. By the which we are set apart, we are set apart through the offering. How do we know it's an offering? John chapter 3, verse 16. For God so loved the world that he gave his only begotten Son, that whosoever believeth on him should not perish, but have everlasting life. For God so loved the world that he gave his only begotten Son. And that's why here it says that by the which we are set apart through the offering of the body of Jesus Christ once for all. And every priest daily ministering and offering oftentimes the same sacrifices, which can never take away sins. But this man, after he had offered one sacrifice for sins forever, sat down at the right hand of God. Jesus was God's sacrifice for you and me. Tomorrow when we come back, we are going to expose what that sacrifice did, what happened when Jesus died, and where it leaves you and I. Thank you for joining us today.
So here I am, consume me. to